Welcome to Farangis of Iran. My guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Mikhal Dekel, Professor of English at City College of New York and the City University of New York Graduate Center. She's the author of Tehran Children and tells the odyssey of her father, Hanan Tidal, and her aunt Regina, who had to flee as children along with 250,000 other Polish Jewish refugees who found themselves in the middle of Soviet and Nazi fighting. Many of the adult refugees stay in Central Asian republics until the war is over and resettle to other places, but about 1,000 children were taken to mandatory Palestine in kibbutzim. In this masterful work, Professor Dekel lays the groundwork for a whole new area in Holocaust study. She also creates an explanatory framework to explain how Israeli society view the Tehran children and how they view themselves.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
I'm so glad you agreed to interview with me.
Sure.
Are you still living in New York City?
I'm actually, I am, but actually I'm in Israel right now.
Mm-hmm.
I escaped COVID and to the warmer weather where I could also get vaccinated.
Yes, fantastic. I'm glad they're vaccinating so fast over there.
Yeah, so it's been, it's been more possible to get back to normal life, or not normal, but, quarter normal, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So if I were to introduce you, since I don't know you personally, but I looked at your book and some of the activities you've done, you're a professor at Columbia of Literature?
I'm actually a professor at City College and the City University of New York. I studied at Columbia. So I teach at City College and at CUNY Graduate Center.
Mm-hmm.
And I direct the Rifkin Center for the Humanities,
Wow.
which is a kind of humanities and arts center. That's about it. And
Yeah, that's a lot. I noted that you had a toddler when you were doing your dissertation, so
that's right.
I don't know how you did it.
And then I had a child, while working on the book. So I don't know how I did it, because I certainly now feel like I can't do it. I don't
So you gave birth to 3 children?
Yeah, exactly. You know how it is. You do it and then you don't know how you did it. But I'm certainly not working at the same pace anymore. That's for sure. What about you? You were you're at Marymount, right?
Yeah, I am a sociologist. I did my defense in 2018. I think I'm crazy because, I'm in my 50s, but I just go from one major career, it seems about every 20 years, to another. And
Good for you. I mean, I actually have my background is in law. I was actually a lawyer before I became. So I also, not in my 50s, but I started.
you're in your 20s, right?
Yeah, I was in my 20s, but I was by the time it wasn't, I wasn't 18 when I started studying literature.
Yeah. So you're definitely on your second career. So what brought you into this topic at all? What drew you to doing this story? It's a very compelling story.
Thank you. So, I always knew that my father was what in Israel was called a Tehran child. So I knew that he was part of this group of children, Polish Jewish children, who ended up in Israel via Tehran. But I never knew the details, and I also never thought of my father as a Holocaust survivor. So I never, when I was a child, I never participated in any kind of Holocaust commemoration and so on. To me, it was simply, he was a Tehran child, which meant he was saved and he was brought through Iran to Israel, and that was that. And now he's an Israeli. And that's the kind of story that I held in my head for many, many years. And as you know, I'm an English professor, so I didn't really work on this kind of stuff, I worked on literature stuff, and then in 2007, I was in a faculty party, and I was talking to my colleague Salar Abdo, who's a writer and teaches with me at City College, and he asked me whether I knew anything about Jewish children who were in Iran during the war, during World War II. And that's really those his questions were what started what 12 years later became this book. So the book became very different, but in part it started because I didn't really know how to answer many of his questions. I just knew that my father had been in Iran during the war, but I didn't really know any details. And that led me to a kind of massive search around the globe that became this book, um, that became the book Tehran Children.
Beautiful. Um, it sounds to me like you didn't even know the questions to ask because the story is so erased. I mean, it happens here too for refugees and like people like myself. We had trouble, we came, and now we're doing a new life. So was it also that that his questions amaze you and say like, I need to know these details?
Yeah, it was absolutely that. And as yes, this happens to a lot of people, but there's also been, especially in the last, I would say, 3 decades, a tremendous amount of research on the Holocaust, Holocaust commemoration, representation of Holocaust in popular culture and movies and in books. But somehow this story, which is actually ended up being the story of most Polish Jewish survivors, didn't make its way into the research and the representation in popular culture and the commemoration. So as I said, I never really participated in the commemoration because somehow this was a story that was kind of outside the framework of what we call Holocaust history. Um, so it did not was not researched by Holocaust historians. It was not really researched by Soviet historians and people who work on modern Iran and so on. So it became a kind of story that fell between the chairs.
Hmm.
And as you said, exactly that. I mean, your story is not part of a kind of larger story that's told, then it's simply it happened to you, and you come to your new place and you start a new life, and that's that. So in some ways, my quest was not only to find the answers to the questions, but find out what questions to ask, and in a way bring that story into the fold of Holocaust history, as well as other histories.
Yes. I think part of the reason maybe it doesn't get acknowledged as a Holocaust history is because of that second chapter where you said like from Hitler to Stalin, like they got out of the orbit of the Holocaust somewhat, but not really. Um,
That's
so
right.
I noticed that your dad's trip was a little bit serpentine. For example, they went this way to India and then back to Iran, like because India is going that way. Can you tell me like the basic route that he took?
Right. No, he actually went from India to Iran and not back. But so if you look,
Wow.
yeah, so if you look, that he starts out here in Poland. The Ostromozowiecka is the town that he's from.
Hmm.
His family escapes to the Soviet border, so kind of around here in Bialystok. They were deported by the Soviets to Arkhangelsk. That's in the northern part of Russia. And other people are deported to other places in the Soviet interior. After about a year and a half, close to a year and a half, they are released from labor camps and they continue on to Uzbekistan. So other people continue on to Kazakhstan or to Turkmenistan, basically to the Central Asian republics.
Hmm.
And this is where most Polish Jewish refugees, survivors remain for the duration of the war. A minority of them, including my father, continue on from here, from Turkmenistan through the Caspian Sea to Iran, Bandar Pahlavi, and then Tehran. Uh,
Hmm.
And later on, they continued through the Persian Gulf to Karachi, which is India at the time, through the Indian Ocean, in a very, very dangerous sea route because this area here is filled with German sea mines,
Mm,
into the Suez Canal, Egypt, and then into mandatory Palestine.
wow. What a journey. Did
Yeah,
a lot of people perish on the way through this
yes, absolutely.
odyssey?
Um, a lot of people perished, whether um, from starvation. I mean, there was in that first leg when they're deported to labor camps, they're deported in these cargo trains, and the deportations are not that much different from deportations to death camps. I mean, they're deported. I mean, they're not deported. They're not gassed in any way, but they're deported basically without food and water for sometimes for you know 14 days. I mean, people die on the deportations. People die in labor camps from starvation and from diseases related to starvation, like typhus and malaria, and extremely cold weather and all kinds of work-related injuries, and they're cutting down trees in these very extreme conditions. And of course, you're talking about people who are city people who are not exactly don't exactly know how to do this stuff. And then in Central Asia was major in 1942, especially there was a major famine, really. And
Oh,
um, so so yes, I mean I'll show you if you want. I'll show you again. Um, what I'll show you what some of these children looked like when they arrived in Iran. Um, so this is what some of the children looked like. This
wow.
this is in a hospital in Tehran in
Mhm.
1942. So the conditions were very brutal, but at the same time there was a chance of survival. Whereas if you were in caught with if you were within the Nazi occupied Poland, Nazi occupied Europe in general, then you didn't really have a chance at survival at all. Here there was, so they would, there's definitely, I mean, the numbers are very contested, but at least 25%, 30% of the people perished in this way.
Wow. I mean, we have such a bad standard for Holocaust survivors that, you know, um, yes, they survived, but looks like they went through hell, you know.
That's exactly right. And in fact, when these children came to mandatory Palestine, which is 1943, February 1943, and they were greeted. This one, this is
Uh-huh.
what I'll show you. So these are the Tehran children arriving in Palestine in on February 19th, 1942, and there was another
Mm,
transport later on in August. And at that moment, the entire Jewish population of Palestine basically goes in the streets to greet them, and they're considered the sort of these survivors who have been rescued and brought to to Palestine, and that's 1943. I'm sorry, I was going to say February 1943. Um, but
mhm.
for 2 years later, after the war is over, and the world and the Jewish population in Palestine really learns finally what exactly happened to basically the genocide of European Jewry, suddenly these children are considered the lucky ones, right? So
Uh-huh.
they're the way they're treated and the way they see themselves also, right? Because suddenly they went through this horrible thing, but in fact, their entire families were murdered. So suddenly their fate seems good, and they're the lucky
Yeah.
ones, but it's only good in relationship, as you said, to the standard of complete genocide.
Mm-hmm. It's very upsetting. So where did they stay when they got off these trains? Did they go to a kibbutz?
Yeah. So most of them, like my father, or not most of them, I would say half of them, like my father, went to kibbutzim, collective settlements,
Mm-hmm.
and this is my father actually in the kibbutz.
Oh,
Nice.
he looks so well fed and
Yeah,
nice.
a lot better, yes. And I should mention that these children were without their parents. So in the case of my father and his sister, their parents remained in Central Asia. They remained in Uzbekistan. And this really was the case for all of the Tehran children. They were either orphans, in other words, their parents had died somewhere along this route, or their parents stayed behind. Basically, for the most part, the Jewish adults were not allowed to be evacuated from Soviet Central Asia to Iran. So the children basically
Wow.
went alone, and they remained alone in even here because this
Was that a policy of the places they were in?
yeah, yeah, there were policies of places they were in and the people they were with. I mean, it's a very complicated
Were his
political.
parents able to leave later?
Yeah, at the end of the war in 1945, there was a repatriation agreement between Poland and the Soviet Union, and Polish citizens, including Polish Jews, were allowed to leave, at least some of them. And it's always the case that it's not, whatever the policy is, it doesn't really apply for everybody, but many people were allowed to leave, and his parents left, returned to Poland.
Mhm.
I'm not sure what happened in Poland, but they very quickly left again, and they ended up in displaced persons camps first in Austria and later in Germany, where my grandfather actually died of tuberculosis. So my grandfather
Wow.
did not reunite with his children, and my grandmother was able to reunite with them in 1949. As we know, in 1948, Israel was founded, and she was able to go there after her husband died. In 1949, after her husband died, she was able to go there and reunite.
Uh-huh. So let's draw into the Tehran aspect of things. Um, from what I can tell, the story of Polish refugees gets a little bit dwarfed by the fact that so many who came were Christian, and people always focus on the cemetery, the Christian cemetery, where many of them actually stayed and were buried in. But I had never myself realized that also thousands of Jewish children were among those people. What was it like when they got to Tehran?
Right. I mean, it was not, these particular children were just about 1,000. So not thousands, but there were thousands of, in total, there were thousands of Jewish refugees, Jewish Holocaust refugees in Iran. I mean, there were also Polish Jewish adults that came in all kinds of ways. Some of them stowaways and in illegal ways. Some of them part of the Polish army in exile, the Edwards army. There were Jewish soldiers in that army. There were also German Jewish refugees and Austrian Jewish refugees in Iran starting from like 1930s. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, it was not, one of the reasons I think people don't know about it is because they did not, at least in the initial period before the Allies basically came in and took over Iran, they didn't advertise their Jewishness. They sort of blended in with the rest of the refugees. But the fact is that for example, German Jewish engineers who in the 1930s wanted to escape from Germany, who with the rise of Hitler, before the Holocaust started, but with the rise of Hitler in 1933, 34, they're looking for places to escape to, and some of them gain entrance visas to Iran, just basically work visas, because they are hired as engineers or as doctors or as lawyers who are basically helpful to Iran, to modernize Iran, and so they come there and they remain there, many of them until well into the late 40s, certainly after the war. For my father and for the other children who were basically embedded with Christian children, with Christian Poles, it was a wonderful thing for them to come to Iran because Iran had bread. Iran was, as you know, I'm sure, a neutral country that was not so much ravaged by the war. Um, it had bread. It had a friendly population, and there are a lot of accounts of just regular Persians being very sweet to the children and buying them candy and giving them apples and so on. I mean, I'm sure you know Sinai's um, um, film, the Lost Requiem, about Polish Christian Poles in Iran. So those stories are, that they talk about the hospitality of locals in a very spontaneous way, are repeated in the testimonies and the memoirs written by these children as well. They later also connect with the Persian Jewish population in Tehran. And again, these are they're Persian Jews, but they're also, for example, Iraqi Jews who are also refugees in Tehran, and they help the children in various ways. The children are taken to a synagogue for the Jewish high holidays, at least some of them are, a synagogue in Tehran. You see, this is the Torah Ark, and the Torah Ark says in Hebrew, Bet HaKnesset HaYehudim HaEropim, the synagogue of the European Jews.
Wow.
Yes. So this is where these other Jewish refugees worshipped, especially beginning late 1942, when basically the Allies come and taken control over Iran, and they depose the Shah, and they replace him with his son, who's more pro-British and pro-Allies. And then there is a kind of period of relative freedom, and the refugees really enjoy that. And their descriptions, there's a memoir written by a rabbi who was there, and he talks about sort of walking in the streets of Tehran with a talit, with these religious artifacts, and feeling like how free he is after 3 years of not being able to worship and not being able to have any kind of communal experience and so on. So it was a good experience for the most part. After a few months, or nearly a year, there begin to be demonstrations, not against the refugees per se, but basically against the foreigners. And I mean, there was a recession, and there is a lot of backlash against all the Allies forces who were there, and the refugees and so on.
Yeah.
So they ended up having to leave. But there is, for the most part, it's a very positive experience. There is no anti-Jewish experience whatsoever. I mean, there is concern that there will be, but there is none.
That period that you cite is also a period that for Iranians started a lot of open political activity and sort of this oasis of freedom that doesn't last very long, but it creates a lot of major political scholars and activists that later come onto the scene.
That's right.
So,
And I think actually, all of these factors are woven together, because the fact that the refugees come there and the Allies come there, and then after the refugees come refugee aid organizations who also come to Iran, and then there is an interaction with the local population necessarily. And so for Persian Jews as well, it begins to be a kind of a period of prosperity, where I think also when you talk about Tudan, when you talk about political activism, Persian Jews become much more part of the public sphere in Iran in that period. So this is all woven together, and it's not, they're not really separate things. They're all connected, and as you said, it maybe doesn't last so long, but it does last for some period.
Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating. So I wanted to ask about your aunt. There was a section where I noted that she was very sick, but she wanted to see you. Your aunt was also a Tehran Children member. What was the story like with her and your experience of talking to her?
Yeah, so my father unfortunately died in 1993, so long before I started on this journey. And it really kills me that I can't speak to him because I know so much about his life now that
He's
I,
watching you now.
yeah, it's so frustrating, right? Um, but my aunt, was his younger sister, my father was born in 27 and he died very young. So he died in the 60s. My aunt was born in 31 and she died basically 2 years ago.
Wow.
She lived a much longer life and she was able to help me in my research. In the beginning, she was very reluctant, like many survivors and many people who've gone through these traumas, and they don't want to talk about it. And she was like, "Why do you need this? Leave it alone." But the more I
Wow.
do, the more she got into it. And she was able to tell me quite a lot, not so much about Iran because she was really a young child.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she was born in 31. She was 11 when she came to Tehran. They also had a cousin with them who was 10. So they were young children, but she was able to tell me quite a lot about their life in pre-war Poland, which she actually remembered in a way more vividly, maybe because it was with her parents and was happier. And also what happened in the journey, and what happened in Palestine, in the kibbutz, and so on. So, and it was for me, it was also a kind of emotional journey. So through the intellectual and the emotional were woven together here again, and just basically knowing so much about their lives just brought me much more closer to her than before, because no one knew this stuff, not her children, not our larger family and the cousins and so on. And that has been really,
Wow.
because they've all been reading her grandchildren and read it. And it's a kind of on a more personal level, it is a kind of tribute to our parents.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, well, may both their memories be a blessing. I did want to say that before we go on.
Thank you.
So, maybe I think you've opened the door to a field that probably needs a lot more scholarship, you know, and I focus on people are so reluctant to sort of go there, but you see it's not unresolved. And like with your aunt, when you first start scratching the surface, they're like, okay, let me tell you what really happened. Was that your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think in part, I almost understand these people because you come in, you're sort of an idiot. You don't know anything. You're like, you don't even know where like Iran is on the map or where Poland is on the map. And you don't understand that, I don't know, there were two periods in Iran, with two shahs, and so you don't know anything. And you come in and you start
Hmm.
asking dumb questions, and people are just, they don't want to start educating you from scratch. So this is on top of not wanting to simply open up these traumas. But I think it's very, ultimately, it is very liberating for everybody to know. A lot of people have been so the book came out in October 2019, and it was very, it came out and immediately it got a New York Times review, and then it got, I got like maybe 50 talk invitations right away. And people started coming to my talk, some of them the Tehran children themselves, and they were like, well, we didn't understand our own journey. I mean, they didn't understand, I don't know why they were taken to Iran and who took them. And so um, my book sort of filled in the pieces of the puzzle that were missing, even from people's own experience. And so it gave them a kind of narrative. Um,
Wow.
because the narrative wasn't really there before. I mean, if, in other words, if I woke up today and I discovered that my father had been deported to Auschwitz, but he never told me anything about it, then I would know what that means because I already read Art Spiegelman and I read Primo Levi and I read Elie Wiesel. So I would already have a framework for that experience, even if my father never told me a word. But if I discovered, as many people do, that let's say their parent was in Samarkand, they're like, how did, what? Um,
Where?
where, what? And I mean, I actually had, believe it or not, amazing experiences where people wrote me or came to my talks and they would say, I can't believe this. I thought my father was the only one in Uzbekistan. Now, I just told you that there were close to 250,000 people who are part of the story. But if you don't have, it really made me realize that if you don't have a story, then you think it's only your story. You don't realize that you're part of a much bigger narrative. So I
That
was,
is amazing.
yeah. So, I was honored. Yeah. So in some ways, I started out writing this kind of small book about my father, ended up being a kind of big book that gives a framework to many other people's stories.
That's exactly right. But there was no framework that I had heard of. In my school where I grew up, I was in an international school. We had the lady that ran the food department for everybody. And, I say department, but it was actually a primitive kiosk and she would make homemade foods for everyone.
Was
She
this in,
was,
this was in Iran?
yes, in Tehran.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. She made these delicious homemade foods for all the children. So to this day, when we're in the group and we talk about, she was a Christian Polish child, but she was older and then ended up staying and marrying an Iranian, and her children were there. So we have a very visceral connection with her. But again, we have no framework. So I really think it's so impressive that you were able to sort of lay the groundwork, and then people can work the details around that, corroborating their own stories. But I think you've opened the door to something very big.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I do, I get emails from people all the time who say that. And some of them are, people like, I was talking to Masha Gessen or, a lot of, this, the story of a lot of people because, whether it was a grandfather or like, oh my God, yeah, my grandfather was in Turkmenistan or in
Mm-hmm.
Iran, because this is really, I mean, we're talking about most Polish Jewish refugees. In other words, there were about 3.2 million Jews in Poland before the war, and 90% of them were murdered. So of the remaining, about 230 to a quarter million remained. It survived in this way. So that's most of the survivors. And we are the
Wow.
descendants of these survivors. So it really encompasses a lot of people who didn't really understand it. And so it's been really incredible to have that. And because it's such a strange story, you don't even know what you don't know. You don't really realize, let's say, that Central Asia was Soviet.
Mm-hmm.
And the records then will be in Russian or in Cyrillic, or so you're even if you're looking, you don't understand where to look, right?
Yes, and things have changed. The political lines have changed, so it's
Exactly.
difficult.
The political lines have changed so much. It's still very hard to research in those areas. It's not that you can just go to Russia even today and just say, hey, take
So
me to.
tell me about that. Which places did you travel to, and were there places that were more difficult than others to gain access to information?
Yeah, I mean, I traveled to Poland twice. I traveled to Russia, and I actually made some of the tour that the children made. So I actually traveled into the Soviet interior. Um,
Wow,
I traveled to Uzbekistan. I did not travel to Iran, unfortunately, because
it's difficult.
as an Israeli, yes, as an Israeli,
Yeah.
I have an American passport, but it was just too risky.
It's very
but
risky.
it's very risky. But my colleague Salar Abdo was able to do some research there for me and other people. And of course, I traveled to Israel. And the hardest place to research, I mean, they're all hard in some ways, but the hardest place is, I would say, is Uzbekistan. I was there in 2013. It was actually, in terms of the level of the dictatorship, it was actually worse then. And it's a dangerous place. It's not a place where you
Mm,
can just operate as a kind of independent researcher. So I had
yeah.
to people sort of helping me clandestinely, and people also don't talk to you. People are afraid to talk to you, so they will say it was all great, everything was great, and so it's. I used to tell my son was like maybe 7 or 8 at the time, and he was very obsessed with Star Wars. And I said to him, Uzbekistan is like when the Jedi come to a planet where everything looks too perfect, and then they realize that something is going wrong, because it's like, we love our country. But at the same
You
time,
got guts.
yeah, but at the same time, it was very, in all of these places, whatever the problematic political landscape was, and it was problematic in each one of them, the hospitality was always amazing. There were always people willing to help and even risk themselves to help. I mean, it's very ironic, these places, as you know, I'm sure from your own experience.
Yes, yes. What compounds the difficulty in a case like yours, I'm thinking, is because the children were children, they don't have a context for what's going on. For example, my mother is Italian European, and I ask her a lot about the war, but her experiences are very sensual and very just in the moment. We went there, and then we had to walk through a riverbed, and then this happened. But the context, you have to put it together with other pieces of information, and the fact that you were able to do that so well is just amazing to me.
Well,
It's
it's
difficult
took
from.
decades. It took a decade. So it took I mean, it was a tremendous amount of work. But yes,
Yes.
I think at the end, with different, working with different archives and sort of marrying, the archives of the Polish government in exile and the Zionist archives and the children's testimonies and everything together. I think I was able to get probably a pretty accurate picture. I mean, I'm sure there'll be more research and more
Fantastic.
come out, but yeah.
Well, hopefully there will be more research.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be. I
Maybe
mean,
is
yeah. I mean, there's already. I mean, I did an event at the Holocaust Museum in Washington D.C. about Iran and the Holocaust a few. Uh,
hmm
this is a month ago or 2 months ago, and I think because after my book came out, they started collecting these documents of people who were in these areas. I mean, and again, a lot of these documents were there, but they were not. They were sort of in all kinds of disparate places, not really collected, and a lot of the documents were not there because people didn't think they had a story. They just kind of kept their documents at home. So now I think there will be. I think this will
yes,
definitely be a front, a new front of research.
fantastic. Yep. Well, so I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It's really been a big treat for me. What are you doing now, and what's your next move, your next big project?
Yeah,
Anything on the horizon?
yeah, I'm working on several things. I mean, I'm working on. I have a lot of material about Poland that actually didn't make it into this book, and because as you saw, this is already a big book, and that material also has to do not just with what happened and not just with the history, but also with the memory politics and with who remembers what and how and so on, and my visits to Poland. So that's probably going to be a separate book. I mean, it is already more or less a separate book that's going to come out. Um, My next big project, which I am thinking about, but I haven't really started it except for a kind of a vague proposal, is to think about this question of the aftermaths of traumas, and especially when it comes to this question of money, question of restitution, reparations in the wake of major catastrophes, and how families rebuild themselves, and the different paths to that. So I'm probably not, that's not going to be, the focus is not just going to be my family, but it's going to be, I'm going to focus on a few different of these cases, including in Russia. And so in former Soviet, let's say families of former Soviet people who were deported, like my family, and then what happened to them in the aftermath. Because, you know, one of the things that you discover when you write a book like mine, I mean, it is focused on Jewish refugees, but there are a lot of other groups that are also part of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, you know, ethnic Koreans were deported, and so what happened to these groups in the aftermath? So it's probably going to be a personal history of a few of these cases. So that's my next big project.
It's interesting that you brought up reparations because I started watching this thing on 30 Years After, which is an Iranian Jewish group in the United States that was established about 10 years ago. So everyone there is like second generation in their 30s. And they started this thing called the Legacy Project. But every person that was in the videos they've already produced says, we lost everything. We came with a suitcase. And there's also this bigger impetus that I certainly like to look at, which is the money aspect of Iranian diasporic, the Iranian diaspora, not
Yeah.
just the Jewish diaspora. But it's so interesting that you brought that up because there's so many ways to slice that cake, so to speak, and to
Right.
deal with that. And I was not aware, so.
Yeah, and one of the issues with the people that I write about, this 250,000, is that they were not included in the German reparations agreement because supposedly they were not within the confines of the Nazi occupation, right? So the Germans have never actually, I mean, they lately they received something, but very little, and it's not, you know, if you receive money in the 1950s, that meant something. I mean, you could do something with that money. Today, it's not really relevant, and most of the people are dead anyway. But the money aspect is very significant, and we're talking also about a lot of people. And then there's also the question of restitution in Poland. You know, for example, my family had a lot of property in Poland, and that was never
Yes, I was
covered.
thinking about that.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, and of course it connects to these larger questions that you're talking about, but not just, for example, for Iranians, for the Iranian diaspora, not just for Jews, for anybody who came here with a suitcase, as you said. And
I'm super glad to have met you.
yeah, same here. It was a
I
pleasure.
think we should talk soon about your Polish project when that's underway.
Sure, I would be happy to, and thank you for inviting me. This was really interesting.
Fantastic. More soon.
Definitely.
Bye.
Yeah, bye bye.